afternoon. It's wonderful to have you all, quite so many in. I think that says quite a lot about our guest this evening. I was telling Ken last week, one of the very first political lunches I ever had as a young reporter on the FT was at the Poule aux Pot. I invited Ken Clarke for lunch. And I was so incredibly nervous to be meeting Ken Clarke that I met him at the table and said, hello, I'm James Harding, and I shook his hand, and he said, hello. And I didn't know what to do, so I shook his hand again. And I remember him saying, are we shaking hands again? And I said, yes, I think we are. So I won't...
Things have changed a lot since then, James.
Well, not that much. I won't introduce him twice, because clearly that's not needed. What I do want to do is just say to you that the aim of this evening, like every think-in, like every open news meeting here at Tortoise, is to make sure that we hear from as many people in the room as possible. As you know, at a think-in, we have this one rule, which is no questions, that people should tell us what they think, share their expertise, give us a sense of their point of view. This is, at the best of times, a loosely enforced rule. It's a positively eccentric one on an evening when, quite a lot of the time, you just like to know what Ken thinks, what he's going to say directly about a subject. So if our complaint with the normal panel discussion is that people, if you like, wrap a point of view in a question, if this evening you actually want to just quite frankly wrap a question in a question, we'll give you an allowance just this one evening. But please do also feel free to weigh in. It should be, over the course of the next hour, a conversation, and a conversation that will touch on, as you expect, many things. One little parish notice, as you'll see, we have a microphone, cameras. We try and make sure that this is available not just to our members who come here into the Tortoise newsroom, but those who are streaming it at home, to welcome to them, and also that if we want to record anything so that we can use it for our future journalism, we will. We have also, like every newsroom, the sense that time is against us. Agatha, our tortoise, is going to make her way across the screen. Matt Dancona, my colleague, Ken, says that Agatha makes her way inexorably to the right, a feeling that I suspect you may come back to.
Most people do with age, but I'm not sure I have.
So please, if you've got a point of view, just catch my eye. If you want to say something, if you want to interject, if you want to ask a question in this case, please do. But Ken, I wanted to start. Firstly, I want to start actually by asking, how do I address you? Are you yet a peer?
No, not as far as I'm aware. It leaked into the newspapers that I was being nominated for a peerage.
Right.
And the dissolution honours. I mean, everything leaks into the newspapers now, and not all of it turns out to be true, but I think Mr. Dominic Cummings or somebody makes sure that every day the newspapers know what's going to happen in a week or two's time. And so I wait to see. The dissolution honours have no doubt been pushed off as they vet all these people, so we shall see whether I appear or not. But no, I am certainly not.
So for now,
here.
Is Ken okay?
Ken is perfectly all right.
Okay.
even where I would go into the peerage, I would not expect a bow and my lord at every question or anything of that kind, I do assure you.
So could we start? Obviously, it has been a colossal career, but a tumultuous, if you like, end to your period of time in the House of Commons. What does it mean in your mind now to be a Conservative?
Well, for me, being a Conservative is you believe in free market economics with a social conscience. You're internationalist, believe in the European project, which I do, and Britain's part in it. I mean, there have been the policies of the party, of the establishment of the party, which ever since I joined it, the last 50 or 60 years, and they were the politics of the establishment of the party I became part of at the peak of my career. And you know, the peak of my career was in the 90s. Most people have the peak of their career when they're in their 50s. So in the 1990s, we actually thought we were on our way to an ever stronger European Union, with Britain's role in that being the basis for our role in the world. We thought we were introducing a globalized economy, huge advances in the developing world, the emerging markets, a rules-based international order. And that was, on the whole, a sort of conservative sort of vision of where the 21st century might go. So they're my views. I'm still committed to all those views. And my period in Parliament has coincided with the birth of those views and, certainly for the time being, their apparent demise. Because I joined the party because Harold Macmillan had applied to take us in to the European project. My first Parliament was the Parliament where we joined the European Union, and my last Parliament was the Parliament when we left it. So I have the good fortune to have had the 47 years in which this country was transformed for the better, ceased to be the laughingstock of the world politically and economically, and became one of the quite influential global players in forming the New World Order, and developed a very modern, very competitive economy, huge increases in our living standards. So at least I personally and my contemporaries have enjoyed the benefits of the conservative principles that I've just set out to you.
And do you think that the fatigue that you sense, that people, even people who are as passionate about remaining as you are, who say now, well, it's done, let's move on and make the best of it, do you think that at heart they're wrong, that actually leaving the European Union will still be a serious mistake and something that impoverishes this country?
Well, I do think, I mean, I'm a politician, I do think the situation is that Britain's membership of the European Union has ended. And I accepted that when I found that there was such a comparatively small number of us who voted against invoking Article 50 in the House of Commons. The majority for invoking Article 50 was quite enormous. I was the only Conservative who voted against it. So this, the entire political class, as far, not entirely, not me, but a few others, the Liberals, the Scott Nats, and a handful of Labour people were the only ones who voted against it. Everybody else has signed up to being absolutely rigidly bound, regardless of their views, by the outcome of one referendum. And the mood by then, I've always in politics accepted the factual situation that you're either benefiting from or struggling with. Fact was, it was pure blind obvious that, sadly, Britain was doomed to leave the European Union. So ever since, I have simply devoted myself to trying to support people who I thought might minimise the damage it's going to cause. That's why I voted for... We had this lunatic argument about a rather unimportant withdrawal agreement, which is perfectly routine and should have been done in about a couple of months as a preliminary before you start the real negotiations. Well, I always voted for Theresa's deal, and I voted for Boris's deal, so we could get on to the grown-up negotiations on the future permanent relationship we're going to have with Europe and the rest of the world. So I've accepted the reality that for the first time in my life, I find myself on the defeated side on a major issue of principle. And I personally still think it's a disastrous decision, and I think it's extremely bad for the next generation or two's prospects. I mean, but I don't sit round just hoping and waiting for disaster so I could turn around and say, I told you so. That is rather stupid, or rather churlish, I think. So I just will argue when we know what it is we're now trying to negotiate. I will argue for the best negotiating aims and the best outcome of the negotiations I can to keep intact what we can and see what we are thinking of doing by way of our role in the world. Because politically, we don't know what our role in the world is. We're kind of Canada with nukes. And our main strength is we're still one of the key players in NATO. We're serious, that's about it. And then economically, we're about to lose, or replace, I trust, membership of a complete free trade area with our principal market for goods in particular. Almost half the goods we export go and were going as if it was our domestic market freely into Europe. And we've got trade deals with about 60 other countries around the world, which also are EU trade deals, which the governments I was a member of used to take part in urging the others to negotiate and press on with. And they're now collapsed. So we have no trade agreements with anybody worth talking about. I think we've rolled over, as they put it, about 7 or 8. But it's all square one now, blank sheet of paper. So I shall contribute not just I try to avoid going back just saying I told you so. I shall say I hope you're successful. You know, I should be overjoyed if you're right, that somehow this is going to be better than where we were before. But please explain to me what it is you think you're now trying to secure, and what exactly you see our relationships with the rest of the world being now, and join in the debate about that.
And what do you say to people who say that the vote in the referendum was a response to their frustration with the system that you and your colleagues in government had helped build over 25 years, that the rules-based system, the internationalism, the free markets had not delivered for them?
I think it was a big part of it. I think there's into even wider things. But I mean, in all these things, on both sides in the referendum, not everybody was voting for the same reason. And that's true on Remain as well as Leave. That's the world. I mean, no two people have exactly the same views. So there are different groups of people who were Remain, different groups who were against. But it wasn't the actual majority, small though it was, they got a majority because I think the biggest block, surprising block, was the protest vote on issues that you're describing. We deceived ourselves in the 1990s when we thought we'd finally worked out how to manage modern economy. We could do monetary policy, we could do fiscal policy, growth with low inflation, and this rules-based international order, and world poverty had never been dropping at a faster rate, our living standards were going up, all the rest of it. And there's this brave new world. It was all going digital. I wasn't going digital, but I didn't mind. Other people were. And there was a rapidly emerging new economy. Now, that's fine for the young, the intelligent, the educated, who happen to be in the right place or able to get to the right place and take advantage of it. Like London, the home county. It's like half the audience we're facing this evening. For rather more than 50% of the population, that pace of change, technological process, the vanishing of the old industrial economy is disastrous. And for some particular localities, cities can cope with it if they happen to be helped sufficiently to adjust. But for the small industrial towns, more remote, less attractive, rural, or less attractive for commuters, rural areas and so on, they're just left behind. And this is what's caused all Western democracies to produce this big, angry protest vote from people for whom everything's changed too quickly, nothing's getting better for them, they're living from day to day, the establishment they hate, the rich they hate and envy, and nobody's done damn all for the place where they live for as long as they can remember. And they vote for Trump, and they vote for Brexit, and they vote for Marine Le Pen, and they vote for Salvini, and they vote for Alternative for Deutschland, and for people who tell them it's all the fault of the foreigners, and it's all the fault of the politicians who are only in it for what they can get out of it, and all the rest of it. Now, I'm warming to my theme. I'm making a dramatic speech on behalf of the Rust Belt vote and the Left Behind vote. But I do strongly believe that theory, and it's now getting very popular, but I've been arguing it for a long time. It's not suddenly happened. It's not a sudden discovery in the industrial north of Britain or in the Midwest of the United States or in the Paris or anywhere else. It has been developing very strongly for the last 10 years. And with us, it's hit us with Brexit. The trouble is, protest votes is, angry protest voters tend to know what they're against. It is very difficult to know for serious politicians, what are you going to actually be for, in favour of, that is going to satisfy and quell this. And I mean, Trump has his way of going about it, and he's quite good at it. And the America First, and building walls against immigrants, and sending the Mexicans back, and getting us out of all these silly foreign wars, and making the allies pay if they insist that we've got to help them defend themselves, and all this kind of thing. I find that singularly unattractive. I'm not sure a version of that would be so successful in the United Kingdom, but I think.
But Ken, what would you?
But anyway, I'm going on a bit.
But what would you do? But Ken, what would you? Because if you just go back to what you said right at the beginning, to be a Conservative is to believe in the free market, to be internationalist, to favour the EU project, and yet then what you described was a deep frustration with all of those things, a failure to deliver.
By non-Conservatives now. Well, they voted Conservative as a protest in the general election as well.
But I'm asking you, what would you?
Brexit.
So what do you do? What do you do now? If you were now the leader of the Conservative Party or the Chancellor of the Exchequer, what do you do now to deliver to those people who voted Conservative in the last election? What do you do to the people who are not young, who are not necessarily well educated, who are not quote unquote in the right place? What is the intervention the government can make to make a difference?
That's a question being faced by every government in the Western world. And I've not yet met anybody who has what I find a totally convincing answer. I'm not sure I have. Analysing the problem is a lot easier than solving it. I mean, I've been involved in urban regeneration and regional policy, everything else. I mean, 30 years ago, I was very heavily engaged with a task force in Hartlepool, trying to turn around Hartlepool. Well, we ain't succeeded in turning around Hartlepool. It ain't that easy. What the politicians usually do when they can't think of anything else to do is build a bypass. Give them roads, railways, infrastructure is very important. All right, I am in favour of HS2 as it happens, but not just for urban regeneration purposes. But the idea of just build a road, Liverpool, when it was a left-behind place, was surrounded by empty roads. It was by governments who give them roads. It's skills training, it's educational standards, it's skills training. It plainly is financial intervention to actually make places more attractive to the kind of modern investment they need and support. Because if you've got a go-ahead modern startup idea in your head, the places we're talking about are the last places you'd think of going because there are no young people there. All the people you might want to recruit have all left and gone to London. And so you've got to reverse all that and intervene in a way which provides not just the physical infrastructure. Every local authority in the country has a business park or a business estate or something, and we've tried free ports before, though I probably would try them again, but they just move things from one place to another if you're not careful. But it's the human capital. So we've always been bad at skills training in this country. And it's the educational standards which are much lower in all these places than they are elsewhere. And it's not just the physical infrastructure, it's the supportive infrastructure generally, and then incentives to make people think of going to these places that I think is now worth trying. But I frankly confess that, as I said at the start of my answer, I think, not only do I don't have the perfect solution. Nice to give you an hour-long lecture on how to revive Rotherham and what to do to put Barnsley back in the forefront of the modern economy. But I don't think I'm sure I know how, and I have never met or heard anybody who's persuaded me that he or she actually knows how, actually has a policy that will work, but it is the most pressing thing on the agenda for the next 3 or 4 years, I think, to start going in that direction. Otherwise, the protest vote that so angrily decided Brexit and sending the foreigners back was the answer, and showing what you felt of the establishment, people like me who put us into Europe all these years and got all these foreigners mixed up with running the country. If in 4 years' time they feel as angry and nothing's happened, I don't know where that's all going to go, but
Ken,
there are dangers.
There's a gentleman here. Sir.
Peter Flynn from BBC. Ken, for someone who's been an MP for as long as you have, which is just slightly longer than I've been born and alive, you'll probably want to say seen it all before, but certain themes have emerged over the last few years that the parties have moved over to their wings, and there's been a purge of those in the middle ground. Populism and the use and abuse of it has emerged as well. What haven't you seen then? And are these things?
I've never seen anything like that. The last 3 years, deadlock in Parliament. And actually what you describe has happened, but it's only happened in the last 10 years. And I've stopped making these wide allusions and comparisons with other countries. The underlying problem's been developing, no doubt, unseen, as it were, for a generation or so. The 2008-2009 financial crash, economic recession, from which most Western countries have still not recovered fully. That's what provoked it all. That brought all this anger out, particularly because the recovery from the recession, the recovery from the financial crisis was typical. For bankers in London, you wouldn't have known it happened after 2 years. Perfectly all right. The Bank of England put a lot of money in demand into the economy. Terrific for one's shareholdings. Very good for the capital value of your house, particularly if you lived in a high-value area. The rich got a bit more capital. In the places I've been describing, their living standards haven't got back to 2007 yet, many of them. And I think it's 2 in 5 members of the working population have savings of £100. So week by week, they're sort of left behind. And it was a reaction to that started the anger rising, greater awareness and resentment of inequalities in the distribution of the rewards, rather than exaggerated feeling sometimes of the inequality of the distribution of rewards, because not everybody in London is living like the top 0.1%. It's quite expensive living in London. But you know what I mean. And then the political reaction has been this polarisation. It's broken up both the political parties, and the structure of the political parties which have always been very, very strange, broad coalitions, British political parties, and have always had internal struggles and civil wars since the two parties started. But they've kind of polarised and widened, and the centre-right and the centre-left has lost the battle in the two parties, and the parties themselves have widened, probably reflecting quite a lot of public opinion. I mean, in London and the home counties, you can find a lot of angry centre-left and centre-right people who can't understand how this has all happened, and, are very, very worried and the rest of it. But one problem for the unfortunate, I suppose, I'm not solely in London. I do have by my time in Nottingham, but as someone who, if the dissatisfied centre-right in my case, the fact is there aren't enough of us. The public out there, if you go out and do campaigning in real parts of the country, the right is stronger than it's ever been before, the real right, and the real left is stronger than it's ever been before. And a lot of it's maybe unfocused, but we've got to get back to a political system which can turn this into sensible government.
Ken, in that context, what do you think of Boris Johnson?
Boris, I've always got on well with Boris. He's extraordinary, larger than life. He's a giant on the stage at the moment because his actual personality really dwarfs any other leading figure in politics at the moment. He is, and you do need a certain theatrical quality nowadays, particularly, but not always. Mr. Attlee was not big on theatrical personality. He was one of the most successful politicians since the war. But nowadays, modern media and everything else, this giant personality and his constant clowning about and humour, his entertaining, his fun company is the dominant thing about him. And he's pursued this maverick career, always desperately wanting to go into politics, always desperately wanting the top job if he could get it, which I don't hold against him, because that's true of at least 50% of people who enter the House of Commons. So the number of politicians I've ever met who are not ambitious is quite tiny. He doesn't have a strong political philosophy. I've never detected one from him. He was always a Eurosceptic, to be fair, although the stuff he wrote for Conrad Black and The Telegraph was obviously what he was paid to write. But he was a Eurosceptic, to be fair.
Does he have an economic...
I was surprised. I never thought he was a Brexiteer. Never remotely thought he was a Brexiteer. But I think it's his instincts. I don't remember any great exchanges with him on policies, particularly, but I always thought his instincts were reasonably civilised, not unlike mine. He always claims he's a one-nation conservative. That's using the old definition. Now, people have changed the word. One-nation conservative now means you've discovered where Sunderland is, apparently. It's north and south. But it used to mean they're kind of with a social conscience Tory, which I think he is. He's...
Does he have
and I just wait to see what he's going to do, because he has the world at his feet. And I hope... I haven't the foggiest notion what he's now going to try to do to produce a successful government. I just tell myself, well, in the real world, what he must be concentrating on now is, now he's got the world at his feet, what's he going to do? And he will want to deliver a successful government. All prime ministers get obsessed with their legacy and all this kind of thing. I'm not sure he's reached that stage yet, but I wait and see. I'm innately optimistic. He's only taken two big, difficult decisions so far, both of which I agree with him on balance. They're neither of them straightforward. But Hawaii providing the antennae and the masts for our broadband, and going ahead with HS2 in full, on balance, I would have argued for those. I always have. I agree with both those decisions. But actually the direction of the government, what sort of government he's going to lead, we haven't a clue. There are no policies, there are only slogans.
Sorry, Ken.
We're just a moment being entertained by Mr. Cummins and his briefing and all this row about what Mr. Cummins is doing. Well, this is a mere preliminary to the proper process of government, which should start soon, in the next week or two, I think.
But do you think we will then get a low-tax, small state, animal spirits conservatism, or do you think we are going to get a somehow higher spend, either debt or tax, probably debt, and more interventionist, if you like, more sort of Clarke style?
Well, I've already revealed. I don't know. I trust the government. No, there has been no statement. There is no policy on any area of government activity at all at the moment. There's no sense of any direction. They didn't need that for the election. Now, that's very good. I don't necessarily disprove that. The most problems in most elections is you lumber yourself with stupid policies, which governments do tend to do at the moment by writing these long, silly manifestos. But there's not too much in that. I don't think we're going to have the Singapore on Thames or anything like that. That will be immensely unpopular, and that would only cheer up the more successful of the young and the young, rich, and rising who are enjoying what's going on at the moment. The idea that is what's going to appeal in the Blythe Valley, I think, is sort of not very likely. I think it's quite likely to be quite interventionist, but for the reasons I've given. A bit more interventionism in order to rebalance the economy and to distribute its benefits fairly. It wouldn't upset me as a one-nation conservative. It depends what sort of intervention. The key thing is intervention which is just chasing headlines or is ideologically driven is always a disaster. Intervention which is trying to steer the country and its services and society in some direction which you hope in 3-4 years' time will produce noticeable improvements, that's called policy. That's what a government's supposed to do. And the great thing about Boris being untrammelled, with no history whatever of detailed expositions of political opinions on specific subjects, means he can do what he likes. And a lot depends what he and the team he surrounds himself with, when he finally does have a team, ought to play for.
Would you, Ken, would you have quit? Do pipe up if you want to, but would you have quit, Ken?
They're rocking silent audience.
I know, they're hanging on every word. Ken, would you, just out of interest, would you have quit the Treasury if you couldn't name your own advisors?
Oh, if my advisors have been sacked by some apparatchik in Downing Street without even telling me, yes, of course I would. And I suppose the only reason Sajid didn't do that was because he'd only been there about a fortnight, I think. And so I suppose he could just not bring himself just to walk out I think it was literally a month or two after he'd arrived. I mean, of all the absurd things to be arguing about. I don't know how they, again, whoever's responsible thinks they're running, how a government runs, an argument about who appoints the rather excessive number of political advisers that the ministers all now have. I can't think of, I say, given my last rather broad sweeping question about policies and all that, I can't think of anything that matters less, really, than who appointing the ministers and political advisers. They're all think tank youngsters. They're very nice. They're very keen. I had one or two good ones, but I never had. I never had more than two. And everybody's always had them, but they're not. They don't make the policy. They're not the government. All prime ministers in my time have always had a right-hand man or woman who's a key advisor, always at the side and always advising, and someone who can test things out of. But that's not the government. They never had one that ran things. And as for the Chancellor's special advisors and the Secretary of State's special advisors, invaluable to the Chancellor. I'm very grateful to my special advisors. But if one of them had been sacked by number 10, I'd have thought this was utterly ludicrous. As I quite liked the people I worked with, I would not have put up with that. I'd have told them to ignore it, stay on, and I'd have gone in to see the Prime Minister and said, "Will you please stop messing around with my staff?" You know? There are a lot of things to discuss about economic policy for the next 2 or 3 years. You just asked me a question about it. And I'd have thought the most irrelevant footnote to the whole thing is how many special advisors does the Chancellor of the Exchequer have and who appoints?
All right, can we ask some of those? So we wanted to ask away and yes.
Yeah, I was going to say.
What's your name?
Dave.
Dave.
You said earlier on about not really knowing what Boris Johnson and that government want to go and do, or what the next move will be. With that in mind, why do you think it is that the traditional media, from my perspective anyway, seem to be not particularly negative about him and kind of seem to avoid overly negative reporting of him and his government and their actions?
Well, I thought the reporting he's getting is absolutely unbelievably dreadful, really. All this, it's cartoons about Dominic Cummings daily, and the sooner they get rid of all that, the better. It needs some solid news, something to be. I mean, to be fair to them, the election's very recent. Its result was a surprise, and so. You know, the sooner they get on to something serious for the media to report, the better. But I don't expect the media to be automatically. The media are biased one way or the other. The newspapers. There isn't a neutral newspaper in Fleet Street any longer. With the Independent gone, the Eye still there. But the Independent was a bit left of centre, to be fair. They're just concentrating on, as there's no news, they concentrate on the gossip. And I don't think they're giving Boris unreservedly favourable write-ups at all. I wouldn't be faintly bit interested in being anybody's media advisor. I don't think I could ever make a press officer, or somebody else has to do that. But if I was a press officer, I would not think the publicity of the last week or two was doing anybody any good at all. So, my view would be, in the heaven save us, the likely event, say I was the Prime Minister, look, the sooner we get off this kind of rubbish, the better. Whose bright idea was it to have a reshuffle in the first place? Now that's all gone. As reshuffles often go belly up. As that's all gone belly up, can we please get on to something serious? That's the publicity Boris wants.
There's a lady over there. Well, there's someone over there. I can't see. Hello.
Just talking about the reshuffle.
Fran, will you just speak up?
Sorry, I couldn't make it up.
Sorry.
Hello.
Just talking about the reshuffle. I think you know, and coming back to serious matters, obviously with my accent, I'd have to ask you about the Northern Irish Protocol and whether or not the new statement from Brandon Lewis, the new Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, if you think that that is legitimate or a lack of understanding, or how would you see that view?
Well, forgive me if I haven't.
It's about he recently said that there'd be no border down the Irish Sea.
Has Brandon repeated that?
Yes.
Yeah, I missed that. If that's, I haven't been following the news today. I haven't had the radio on or anything, so I haven't driven anywhere, so I haven't had the radio on. So and it's all about storms. I thought the news today anyway. But I genuinely did miss that. I'm sorry. Well, on the reshuffle, I won't wax lyrical about it, but the one thing I really personally. I mean, I've always disagreed with reshuffles in governments where I've been confronted. I've never been sacked, but I've been reshuffled far too often. It's extremely annoying to be moved out of a department too soon. No two people ever agree in a reshuffle. The part of the reshuffle I most disapproved of was sacking Julian Smith, which was extraordinary. He's the best Northern Ireland secretary we've had for a very long time. The crisis in Northern Ireland is now extremely serious, and for him to produce a deal to get back to devolved government and start restoring some sort of orderly politics in Northern Ireland was a considerable achievement. So to sack somebody immediately after he's achieved a political success, which is more than, because they've only been in a month, any other member of the government has, so far. I'm sure some of them will produce great successes, but to sack him, inexplicable. I mean, all because apparently he said something at some stage that upset somebody in number 10. But I'm not. That's only. I'm only repeating, press commentators' guesses at why Julian has been sacked, and I haven't seen him since he's been sacked, but when I do, I try to find out if he has any idea why he's been sacked. Brandon has got to make sure we don't start going backwards again after the best progress we've made in Northern Ireland for some time against a difficult background, which is the one you referred to. If the withdrawal agreement, as the withdrawal agreement stands, then it's quite obvious that you have now an economic trading frontier down the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. And politicians can talk till they're blue in the face denying it, but in fact, in the real world, there's nowhere in the world where you would operate an open border between systems with two sets of regulatory standards and different trading arrangements with the wider world. Otherwise, if they really are going to go ahead on the basis just of the withdrawal agreement with no frontier, any entrepreneur in the room should invest in a few trucks because there's a fortune to be made in smuggling in Northern Ireland. My take, one encouraging thing from it may be that, of course, as we don't know what it is we're trying to negotiate, and if we're trying to negotiate a new arrangement by the end of this year, which is pretty quick, there are only two things you can negotiate that quickly, I'd have thought. Broadly, something which is very vestigial and not much by way of a trade agreement and relying quite heavily as WTO rules as a backup, because that's quite easily done, or something that isn't actually changing much from day to day and not too unlike what we have now. And it is perfectly possible to have a trade deal, and we should seek a trade deal, I think, which keeps borders open, flowing as they are now, not just without tariffs, but without the customs procedures and the costly delays and so on, at Dover and at Holyhead, at Harwich, and down the Irish Sea. Of course, it will not be the single market. Of course, it wouldn't be the customs union. We've ruled that out. But there are regulatory alignments and there are customs arrangements which are uniquely British and with a Union Jack flying on the top of them, which look keep intact quite a lot of what we have now and stop further crises in Ireland, meaning you can operate it without having control of the border. But as it stands, if the withdrawal agreement's it, and we just leave on the 31st of December without any substantial further progress, then of course there's a frontier down. And of course you'll have to incur costs and fill in forms and have delays. But we're not ready for that, because my guess is we haven't even got the planning permission for the lorry parks at Dover yet, or Holyhead, or anywhere else.
Where was I looking? Steady here. Now I come to you. So, Mike. Yeah, hello.
Hi, my name's Jo Carpenter. I had a question around trust.
Around?
Trust. Yeah,
trust.
Can you hear Jo? Sorry, yeah, Jo.
So the question around trust is that for me, what I see is a breakdown in trust between the electorate and all political parties, because I'm not sure there's been a good performance from any, if I'm honest. But it's also trust between communities, because it's the division. So it's the whole point about divisions across our society, the political system, and how do you rebuild that trust and cohesion so that we can operate economically at our best in difficult circumstances. It's going to be very difficult, I think, the next 5-10 years, and come together, because if we don't, it's going to be worse rather than good.
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think you had one of the absolute key points. And to be fair to today's politicians, this breakdown in trust goes back to the 2008-2009 crash and the situation. The public are unbelievably cynical at the moment. I mean, quite excessively cynical. The view, there's no point in voting for any of them. They're all only in it if they can get out of it. They're all taking backhanders, which is ludicrously untrue, is comically widespread in the more difficult societies. And that's all part of this not trusting them, and they're not doing anything for me, and they don't understand how people like me live, and all this sort of stuff. And you've got to restore that. I mean, all societies are always divided politically. And there'll be some members of society with very strongly different opinions from some other members of society. That's just life. That's the human condition. But a working democracy, the political class as a whole, has enough people who are trusted and can marshal things for people to identify with one lot or the other, and to believe that it's a sensible thing is to try to lobby this lot and try and support them and get things going the way they want. And a lot of that is political presentation. If you look back historically, it's always been a problem, particularly at times of crisis. The tendency is for the public to want simple, instant solutions to problems. They want simple, instant solutions which don't disadvantage them or their families particularly, and so on. And so it's quite a difficult ground. And the best political leaders are people who can explain what they're doing, why they're doing it, in a way which commands some confidence and inspires people to think they can make a difference. And obviously, most politicians can get their closest supporters to in a cheering crowd at an election rally or so on, but to get that wider, have a lot of the public believe that this man, this woman, whatever else you may think about them, it's all going in the right direction, To get back to that, it's partly political presentation. And that's where I'm too old to answer the question, because the platform for politics is changing. I'm of the generation where that was all about public meetings, it's all about television, radio, relationships with newspapers, news conferences, and so on. They're all still important, and we are thin on all sides of politics in today's generation of politicians, people who are much good at any of that. Certainly in using it to express themselves in any way in which people understand and identify with. But there's this whole emerging world of social media, which I'm an old fogey. I deplore it, don't understand it, and think how on earth you campaign through it, I'm not quite sure. and the complete failure of the political class to control or master this at the moment, apart from campaigning crudely with targeted stuff, just trying to win votes in a campaign, but to control, campaign in the social media in a way which wins the widespread trust of the majority of those who acquire their knowledge of politics and give their own views of politics through the social media. I don't get a sense that's happening, although I'm probably the last person in the room should even try to struggle with that, because I'm probably the only person in the room who's never tried to follow a political debate. And when I've been shown pages, it seems to be personal insult, usually, rather than any exchange of views. It's a rather childish way of debating, I've always thought, but that's, I say, that does mark me out finally as an old fogey who
Okay, I'm
kept up with the time.
going to take a run, if I can, of points and provocations. There's a lady over there, there's a gentleman at the back here, and you two, sir. Yes.
Right, shall I start?
Yeah, go far away, yes.
I'm going to try and respect your rules of not asking any
Yeah,
questions.
give us a point, better still.
Okay, so I'm a...
What's your name, sorry?
My name's Emily,
Emily.
and I'll introduce myself as being a trade geek. So I wanted to actually get onto the part of the negotiations with the EU and what WTO terms actually mean. Essentially, we would have 9 months to negotiate a trade deal, and we know that there is no blueprint to date in the world to negotiate a trade deal where the starting point is full regulatory alignment. Essentially, when we start a trade deal, normally the point is that we want to converge, we want to be better friends, and this is quite an acrimonious start. We have David Frost this evening in Brussels saying no level playing field, which is obviously going to start, let's say, quite some concerns out of the European members as a starting point into 9 months of negotiations. Keeping in mind that the average tends to be 4 months, 4 years.
Yeah, I was going to say.
At best, to actually negotiate a trade deal when we are already friends to start off with. I'd like to know what you think is feasible in this time, but also on the point that you made earlier on WTO sort of as the fallback, I think that we need to be very, very clear that even should the UK wish to keep full regulatory alignment with the EU, falling out the customs union, that might not be possible.
Yeah.
Because international rules don't allow that. And so I think that controls and import controls are going to be a basis. So I'd like to hear your points.
Emily, thank you very much. This gentleman, I'll come to you in a moment. Sir,
Ian Rennie. I'll try and not phrase that as a question then, hearing the rules.
Okay, great.
But I think you talked about political presentation, and I just wondering that with that compared with your views of being a one nation Tory, by many measures, we have the most unequal society we've had since the 1920s, and we've had the post-war settlement. We then had Thatcherism and that neoliberal view, and then with the financial crisis, that sort of model, that settlement, kind of, it to many people fell away or became fundamentally flawed. And since then, we've been pandering around trying to sort something out. And as you've said, the government today has very little on policy. If you had a magic wand, what would be the policies that brought those inequalities back and we did start becoming one nation?
Okay, there's a gentleman here, and there's a gentleman behind you, sir, in the jacket.
Just very briefly, you mentioned...
sorry, would you say your name?
Andrew.
Andrew.
The rise of the right wing on the Tories and the left wing of Labour, and I don't disagree that there may be increased numbers there, but I think they're noisier rather than necessarily in the majority. And I wonder, therefore, whether we should be thinking about proportional representation to give a voice back to centre-left and centre-right.
And there's a gentleman behind you at the back. In fact, I have two. I'm going to give you just one after the other, if it's very quick. Yes.
This will be quick. Yes. This is an unfriendly question.
Yeah.
You talked about trust. I'm no Brexiteer. I voted Remain. What do you think it would have done for trust if MPs had taken the path that you took and not voted to trigger Article 50?
If MPs have done what?
If MPs had not triggered Article 50 after the European referendum in 2016?
Yeah, what might that have done? Yeah. And there's a gentleman just next to you who wanted to say something.
Oh yeah, I'm Chris. This is a question, I'm sorry. Quick, yes, no. Do you think in your lifetime, or anyone's lifetime here in this room, could we ever see a, how do I have to write it down, a Brorienta?
Yeah. As in, can we go back in?
Yeah.
Back into the European Union.
Yeah. Well, I'm
going to keep you to relatively tight.
Yeah, I should have said, no, I've got 5 totally different questions.
Okay, question 1.
I thought I was going to remember them all.
Okay,
and you're giving me 30 seconds to answer them all.
Do you think we could re-enter the European Union within the next 25 years?
Well, I would like to believe so, but I don't think I'll live to see the day, personally myself, but simply because of my age. The European Union has got to develop itself. The European Union has lots of internal... My idea of the reforms in here are much nearer to Mr. Macron than they are to those of John Redwood. But the EU is facing challenges, but if the EU can sort itself out and remain the third power bloc in the world, but also get itself going as a successful, cohesive defender of European interests and a good economy, then I would like to believe myself that my children's generation, or whatever, sooner or later, it's going to start dawning on people that Britain should really be, with the French and the Germans, the leading member of the bloc. But that's just a nice hope that I have. At the moment, it's no useful guide to action. To the question of trust and all the rest of it, I voted as I did because I also, before the election, at the election, made it quite clear that, I was against the idea of holding a referendum. I had a bloody great row with Cameron. I don't think countries should be run by referendums. Broad brush, simplistic, yes, no answers to huge questions containing hundreds of other complex issues which most people have never heard of. It was absurd. And I was not going to change my own lifelong convictions on the strength of one day's opinion poll on a question like that. And so I felt fearfully sound in voting against. In fact, I regard it as idiotic for me not to vote against invoking Article 50. The trouble was, everybody had assumed, the entire British establishment, that Remain was going to win. I mean, Boris and Nigel Farage thought it was as obvious that Remain was going to win as David Cameron did. They were all absolutely astonished by these extraordinary results, again from the north of England, that suddenly gave Leave a majority on the night of the referendum, and they'd signed up to it.
And do you think if Parliament had in a majority voted against the revocation of Article 50, that would have actually damaged trust in politicians?
It would have enraged. Well, the public were very divided. It would have thrilled the 48% who voted Remain, and it would have infuriated the 52% who voted Leave, a far too high a proportion of whom were convinced that all the people who disagreed with them were traitors anyway, whichever side you happened to be on. So it would have worsened the political debate, certainly. You'd have had to explain why a 52-48% majority on a simplistic question was not an adequate basis. So you probably could have argued, look, let's think about it again when we work out what kind of new relationships we're going to have. I voted against leaving Euratom, which for some reason came up for a vote. And one of my colleagues ticked me off and said, our masters, the people, have ordered us to leave Euratom. and the idea that the referendum was a decisive vote on the adequacy of nuclear safeguarding policy in this country, I regard it utterly ridiculous. And on bigger issues than that, you have to explain why, you cannot conceivably say that all these myriad issues are now to be determined by a close result in a referendum where the arguments on one side were George Osborne going on about an immediate deep recession that was going to hit us in 2 months if we didn't vote yes, and on the other side about millions of Turks who were going to come here and take our jobs if we didn't vote no. Absolutely none of the arguments now, which the lady over here wants to talk about, the trade deal, they weren't mentioned in the national debate at the time of the referendum. Everybody was given the impression that nothing would change so far as the economy was concerned, whichever way you voted.
But Ken, just I'll address Emily's point. Is it the case that we are headed once again for disappointment? Is it likely that by the end of the year, within 9 months, we're not going to be able to come to some kind of new agreement, that divergence on that short timetable is just not feasible?
It's a challenge. I mean, otherwise, you made the points that I largely agree with. These things take years. This is quite different to any other trade agreement I've ever heard of, for the very good reason you give. All other trade agreements involve having obstacles to trade between your two countries and trying to haggle a bargain, a compromise, which enables both of you to improve access to each other's markets. We start with total free trade. Our domestic market is the European market, and they have free access to every part of the UK, as we have free access for goods to every part of the EU. And we're talking about how far we worsen. What are we going to reduce by way of our trade relationships? How far do we want to go to put in new differences between us? And the other thing about trade agreements and level playing fields and things is no two countries will ever sign a trade agreement on the basis that one side is completely free to lower all its standards, to nationalise and subsidise goods and then dump the product in your other market. Nobody's going to sign up to say, of course you're a sovereign state. We quite accept if you want to start nationalising some clapped-out factory somewhere and dumping its products subsidised by the taxpayer into my market, feel free and all the rest of it. The level playing field is a silly phrase, but the mutual interest of both sides of the agreement involves just ensuring, enforceably and legally, that neither side is going to behave in an unfair way to take advantage of your own producers and your own market and all the rest of it. So it's quite complicated. And now I think the reality is no sane person on either side of the channel actually wants a no-deal Brexit. WTO terms alone, it's not true. They keep trying to make things sound attractive and comprehensible by comparing with white dominions. At the moment, we wish to be reminded that we're like our white dominions. So it's either a Canada deal, which isn't very much use to us, but they do have a deal, or it's an Australia deal. It sounds nicer, no deal, if you say it's all those white people in Australia, They don't have a deal, and they're trying to negotiate a deal. Only countries that actually trade with the world, I think, on WTO terms are, is it Serbia, Algeria, and North Korea, I think. They're not attractive. It's a fallback position with universal tariffs against all countries, universal standards and all the rest of it. But for us, starting from where we are, because we're such a big, important economy, we're not as important to the Europeans as a whole as they are to us, but to France and Belgium and Holland, Ireland, we're very important. They don't want no deal either. So instead of faffing about, threatening each other with no deal, when you look at what they are going to strive to negotiate, most of our present free access, both sides will want to retain. I mean, what is the point of disrupting the supply lines of our car industry, for them or for us? What is the point of annoying all our Japanese investors? When it comes to changing standards, regulatory standards, well, what exactly is it about the fuel consumption of washing machines or the noise made by lawn mowers that people actually wish to change so that we have different standards? So there's whole sectors of the economy where, with any luck, you'll be able to have an agreement saying, well, certainly for the foreseeable future, unless we both agree otherwise, we'll keep the status quo. That is how you could get to a conclusion by the end of the year which is the least disruptive. You also have the problem you're going to be trying to negotiate an American trade deal, but I don't think you'll have that by the end of the year. Donald Trump will want it quickly, so long as we buy all the food, because he needs the vote for his election. But once his election's over, I think his desire that we open up our market to beef and chicken and soy or rest of it, that will vanish. Well, it won't vanish. It will be a precondition of any trade deal with America that we open up our market to their food. America's going to take a long time. It's a deeply protectionist country. We tried to, I was involved in trying to get an EU deal with the US before the election, the coalition government. And Congress was the problem, even in Obama's time. We want to open up the market to financial services, and we want to open up public procurement. That was our aim. Well, I can tell you after it was on the fringe, so I wasn't negotiating it, but I was leading for us. I was getting involved, and we got nowhere. I mean, Trump's people would have agreed. Trump himself wasn't very interested. Congress is impossible. The lobbies in Congress, even the regulators. The idea that any car made in Europe doesn't have to go through full American regulatory process is a threat to perfectly good jobs in the office of the regulators. They're not going to have any of that. Thank you very much. We don't mind you opening up yours to ours, but that's...
The sad fact is that, as you will have seen, Agatha, unstoppable that she is, has raced past the finish line, and the flag is up.
So my wise words about
your wise words about the future of dealing with the lobby are the lobbies in the US are done. I want to just, if I can though, just replay for us the thing that you said and finish on a point, because actually often these days what we find is we come into our newsroom and we are susceptible to a level of optimism. We're susceptible to a level of can-do around the problems we face in the 2020s. And to have listened to you this evening is to listen to someone who is unusually candid in saying that the problems we face we understand, the problems of inequality, regional inequality, wealth inequality, are clear for all of us to see, but that you don't have an answer and you haven't met anyone else who does. That you talk about a government that is now led by someone...
Well, that was the big question. Yeah. How to make the North of England as prosperous as home counties.
Hang on, hold your horses. The thing I want to say is you've painted that on the big picture in terms of political philosophy. On the government, you talk about having someone who is got enormous charisma, but very, very little detail as far as we know on policy. You talk about our position in terms of trade and our prospects for delivering by the end of this year in a way that you've got to have high hopes that we're going to do even half of the things that we say we're going to do. And perhaps most worryingly for all of us, to the point that was made about trust, is you talk about a system in which we don't have people who've got mastery of the old skills in politics, speeches and interviews, etc., but you've got only manipulation of the new media, that you've got people micro-targeting to get their results. And that's got to undermine our trust in democracy. And so the one thing I just wanted to end on is you give us a picture where it's unclear what the policy position is, it's unknowable what the government is, and it's deeply uncertain what the prospect is for democracy. And yet you do it all with such good cheer. And so I wanted to finish this evening, if you could, by telling us why you are cheerful, why you are optimistic about the future.
Well, it usually irritates my friends when that I do get. I'm so laid back that I'm almost horizontal. So it's my approach to things. That's what makes politics so interesting. Predicting politics is a complete waste of time because events are completely unforeseeable. Events take mad turns that nobody ever remotely saw coming along, and the ability to react to them is the point. And at any given stage, inevitably in the modern world with a large country like ours and so on, and a complex society like ours, the range of problems you can describe is absolutely enormous, and a feeling of total confidence you're going to solve all of them. If you've got that, you're deceiving yourself. You're some sort of a nut. It's usually the only people who are confident they can solve them all are the extremists of right and left, who have their simplistic little answers to everything.
But are you really optimistic? Are you really optimistic?
When I got elected in 1970, you could have produced as formidable a list of things which were absolutely impossible. My pro-European thing is a delayed reaction. That was a sixth form where it only dawned on me very shortly afterwards, to Suez. I mean, we were an absolute joke internationally. We were a satellite state of the United States, but that was really our role in the world. Locked into a Cold War, which I never thought would end in my lifetime. Most of my generation assumed we would live through a nuclear war at some stage or another. I never dreamt that the Berlin Wall was going to start collapsing. And economically, we were a complete joke. We were locked into a declining, old-fashioned economy with militant trade unionism. I'm not against trade unionism, but trade unionism had taken a political and extremist form, defending every ancient demarcation rule, restrictive practice, demanding subsidy for every clapped-out industry, and winning its way in most areas. So I won't go on, because I can't remember every problem we faced.
But Ken, here's the question.
But the idea of the outlook was easy, and there was this marvellous map laid out for us, and all we had to do was go on, ever onwards, ever upwards, and our manifesto had the answer to every problem. It was not true at the beginning of any period of government I can remember in my lifetime.
So are you genuinely optimistic, or are you pessimistic but cheerful?
My temperament is optimistic.
Good.
So I'm pretty optimistic. I'm usually cheerful, but it becomes black humour and cynicism in my old age rather more. I am politically a bit down because it's the first time in my life, but every politician should get used to it, it's the first time in my life that I've been on the losing side in a really major political defeat. So, and I say, so I am like a guy who's had a pretty good run in a football team, but had just come off the pitch after a 7-0 thrashing in a rather key game, and we've been relegated. But that hasn't suppressed my natural cheerfulness.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to see the footballer himself in the dressing room, Ken's kindly agreed to sign some copies of his book, Ken Clarke, appropriately titled Kind of Blue, the only book I've ever seen that's got a recommendation on the front that begins like a fine old wine. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Ken Clarke. A very quick practical thing. Would you be kind enough just to let Ken out, because the green room at the back is where he'll be signing copies of the book. If you're not a member of Tortoise, please sign up.